Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of What's the Res? We are dedicated to hosting the ongoing conversation about the current resolutions in the world of high school debate. Tonight's episode features former high school debater Dr. Brad Birzer. Dr. Birzer is the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies and Professor of History at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. He is also the co-founder of the Imaginative Conservative, an online journal of conservative thought. He's the author of several biographies, including the lives of Andrew Jackson, J.R.R. Tolkien, Christopher Dawson, and Russell Kirk. I am proud to say that I took Dr. Birzer's Jacksonian America history class about a decade ago. I can't believe it's been a decade, but it's been that long. Tonight we'll be discussing Dr. Birzer's most recent book entitled Beyond Tenebrae, Christian Humanism in the Twilight of the West. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. I'm proud to have had you as a student, so this is great. I'm glad we're able to do this. I always enjoy getting in contact with each other whenever we can.
It's true. It's too rare. The paper I wrote for that class was the one I submitted for proof that I could write a paper for my doctoral program at Faulkner.
Nice.
That was
nice.
I don't know if you probably don't remember that. I know you see thousands of papers. You've seen thousands of papers. That was one on John Humphrey Noyes and the Oneida community.
Oh yeah, sure.
Once upon a time.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. I have seen a lot of papers, but yes, I remember your paper very well. That's great, Josh.
Well, I remember we crossed paths a couple summers ago, and you mentioned that you actually did debate back in high school. Tell us a little bit about that.
That was actually my life. Really, that was everything. I'm not sure I would have made it through high school without debate and forensics. So, yeah, I started in the fall of 1982, and then I graduated high school in the spring of 1986. So we had a lot of great debate programs. I did Lincoln Douglas. I did two-man. I did student congress. I did extemporaneous speaking. I did one-man drama. Yeah, it was probably those are not politically correct anymore, right? Two-person, right? Not two-man. But anyway, yeah, I did all that. That was my life for 4 years, and I loved it. I was a member of the National Forensic League, and yeah, it was great.
We actually just my school just joined. They've rebranded now. I don't know if you're familiar with the current lingo, but they're the National Forensics League, doing business as the National Speech and Debate Association.
No, I did not know that.
I heard from another coach.
I remember the NDSA.
Yeah. Apparently, a lot of people got confused when students would say, "Oh yeah, I'm in the NFL," and everyone, of course, assumes football, and so. But we actually we've now got students. So did you have the certificates and the seals and all that? Was that a thing then?
Again, we used to get rostrum and definitely.
Oh yeah, well we're now, wow, that's amazing. That's fantastic.
Yeah, even back in the 80s, we were that advanced, Josh.
It just I didn't really realize how much of a tradition we were getting into when we officially joined up.
And we actually had three districts in Kansas. That's how huge debate was in Kansas. It was huge. It was a major. I'm sure it still is, but it was definitely a major event back then.
You said you're not sure you would have made it through high school without debate. What was it particularly about debate that kind of got you through high school? Was it the travel, the research?
Yeah, the travel was fine. That was something you had to kind of put up with. I always loved the debating, and I loved being at different high schools. So that was great. But I went to a good, but it was still a public high school. I went to a good public high school in Hutchinson, Kansas, some great friends, and I had some good teachers, but I think I would have been bored without having debate. And it really kept me, not just the topics we had for policy debate, but for LD, just kept me really interested all the time. And I can't even believe I could do this now. I don't think I could do it at this point, but, this was back before the internet. So, every week we got the Wall Street Journal and the Christian Science Monitor and the New York Times. And of course, then all the big magazines, Time and Newsweek and US News. And my friends and I could name every person in the Reagan administration. It was, back in those days, I knew people in the Senate and then in the House. And I could tell you now some of the people, but nothing like I could then. I knew everything about arms sales going on in Libya and Israel.
That's so funny. policy
Great
debate
stuff.
this year is back around to an arms sales topic. So
is it really?
Yeah, it's
that's great.
I assume it's kind of a time-honored formula, but it's something like arms sales to Saudi Arabia should be discontinued, or something like that. We don't really do policy. We do public forum and Lincoln Douglas and debate with the Coolidge League. Well, now I am curious also about. I know your career has been really fantastic, and I've loved watching over the last few years as you picked up some pretty big notoriety as far as professors from small liberal arts colleges go. Man, you keep publishing books, you keep getting these chances to go speak at big name conferences, and you were out at UC Boulder for a year as the
that's right. That was a really nice honor.
Wasn't that the I remember seeing your title there, Visiting Professor of Conservative Thought. Is that right?
Yeah, they've changed it now. Yeah, visiting Scholar of Conservative Thought and Policy. Okay, that was it. Well, yeah. Now I think it's Western Civ and Policy, but yeah, they took the conservative out.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll come back to conservative here in a few minutes. I want to get your thoughts on defining that wonderful word.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Your career has gone in so many different directions between teaching in the classroom, writing, and public speaking, and your formal training as a historian. Do you see any connection between all that and debate, or are those completely unrelated areas of your life?
Oh no, in almost every way, Josh, and I'm sure you feel this too as a coach. Debate just shaped the way I think. It shaped the way I research. It shaped the way I think about writing papers. It gave me confidence in the classroom to be able to speak my mind. And I know that was a huge advantage when I went to college, just having that confidence to be able to state my opinions when, other students may have been even smarter, maybe a lot smarter, but they just didn't have that same confidence. And I think that gave me it gave me a lot of my own personal self-confidence, and it helped a lot. But I'm sure you see that all the time, Josh.
Oh, I do. I mean, and I see it even in, there's some students who I'm sure your team had these folks too, who we've got kids who go to a tournament and they always have a positive win-loss record. But we've also got kids who, man, if they win a single round, I am just floored, because that's really unusual for those students. But when we're not at a tournament day and they're just in the normal life of the school, all of those students stand out. Even the ones who at a tournament, they're the bottom of the heap as far as competitiveness goes. Yeah. But compared to their students who never do public speaking or debate, like, oh my goodness, they can articulate their views and they're so quick to respond, and they're almost just more alert in a certain way.
No, that's right. I mean, it teaches you how to focus on certain ideas and then just kind of narrow down on that. So yeah, I mean, it was indispensable for me in every way.
I'm so glad to hear that, because one of the things that I love doing on this podcast is getting the stories of folks who were in debates. We had a professor at Harvard, a guy named Joe Aldi, was on the show a couple months ago. And he did LD and policy in Kentucky in the late 80s, very early 90s. But he said similar things. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. It's fun to think about too. It's been so long.
Well, I do want to get to your book, because I really enjoyed reading this. It arrived. I think I saw it was published, I think about 2 weeks ago is when it was available.
Last Monday, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so almost a week and a half ago.
Perfect. So we're still pretty early on.
Definitely.
The book is titled Beyond Tenebrae, Christian Humanism in the Twilight of the West. Listeners, if you haven't ordered your copy, the link will be in our show description, and you should definitely order a copy. But Brad, as I read this, it felt like you. It felt like I was back in your class, and there was a mix of stories and analysis and just a quintessential Birzer take on this. So could you tell us just a little bit about this book, and tell us the story of the book? Where did this book come from?
So I'd had a chance to meet I've never actually personally met, but to get to know the editor through correspondence, a guy named John Reese. And he had put together Angelico as a press a few years ago, and I think has really done some very interesting philosophical and theological work. And I was getting to the point where I've been writing, as you know, Josh, I've been writing for the Imaginative Conservative for 9 years now. And I'm up to the point where I'm doing 2 pieces a week. For a long time, for those first kind of 7 years, I was doing 1 piece a week. And I realized that as we got to a certain point, I was close to something like 900,000 words that I'd written for TIC. And I'm now, as far as I know, I'm somewhere around 1 million, which is insane when you almost like a disease or something, some kind of psychological problem. But I started thinking about all these vignettes that I'd written, and I thought it would be kind of fun to put them together as a book. And some of my favorite, just looking at other authors I really like Russell Kirk, some of my favorite books of his were ones where he was able to put together a variety of essays that he'd written and then kind of make it into a coherent whole. So I guess for me, the book was kind of a puzzle. It was kind of, how do I take these separate things I've written and then try and tie them together and make it into a cohesive whole, try and find some kind of narrative that holds it all together.
Well, that fits. As I read it, I was trying on the one hand, I thoroughly enjoyed each section of it. And some essays there were several essays that you've written entire books on those folks. And your 6-page version of Christopher Dawson, or however many pages that chapter, like,
no, that's right.
There's such a depth in those pages. And especially, I love the essays about your grandparents. Those were amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, my grandparents meant everything to me.
I was trying to figure out, okay, what is it that I understood the first part. I was like, okay, the first part is laying out kind of some defining, here's what you mean by humanism, here's what you mean by conservatism, and so on.
Right.
And then the rest, like, what holds these 27 chapters together? And at least what made sense in my head was that it really, you were sort of almost playing a symphony. And some chapters had larger parts and some chapters had smaller parts, but they all kind of blended together in this beautiful symphony of different voices all having a similar conversation stretched across a century. It wasn't the tight unity of a monograph. It was a different kind of unity, but it all fit together very, very well, I thought.
Thanks, Josh. It's partly I did that intentionally because I was trying to mimic Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, because there he uses 29 figures. So that book is based on 29 vignettes and trying to pull that together. And I wasn't trying to do something as comprehensive or as deep as what Kirk was doing. But I have become convinced, and this actually goes back to my high school debate days, I've become very convinced that one of the best ways to understand history and to figure out things like free will and what can we do and what kind of difference do we make is really to look at these individual lives. And I did that with the Jackson class too. Mm-hmm. I'm just really interested in trying to figure out, okay, here are these people who have no choice about where they find themselves. But then once they find themselves in those places, they have all the choices in the world, even if they may be rough choices or if there's all kinds of, like my grandparents with World War II going on, or many of these figures who are in here having to deal with all kinds of Alexander Solzhenitsyn trying to deal with the Gulag. And, they're extreme. Some of them have to deal with actual blatant evil right in front of them. Others just have to make choices about, well, how do I take these kind of not so good situations and make something good out of them? So for me, that's what ties it together, trying to figure out how does the kind of human person or the individual properly understood, how do they respond not only to their own life, but to the lives around them as well. So that was really kind of the goal. And the whole title of Beyond Tenebrae was to get past kind of, Tenebrae is the Catholic celebration of, not celebration, it's really more of a mournful acknowledgement, but it's the recognition that Christ is absent from the world from Good Friday until Easter morning. So Tenebrae is that darkness. And part of what I was trying to do was to get beyond that darkness and see what can individuals do. And especially, not that we're saints by any means, clearly we're not, but are there saintly things that happen and we make these good decisions even in the midst of bad?
That's a beautiful, I thought that's a beautiful metaphor, I thought, of really, and it captured the idea of this present moment, I thought, pretty well, and really of the darkness of the 20th century. And yet you have this, there's throughout this, I thought these lives worked very effectively to have this note of hope throughout the darkness. And that even if right now we're, At least it seems like our current moment, we're flustered with so many things that should be self-evident, but we're consumed in debates about pronouns of all things that should be self-evident, but for many people are no longer self-evident. There's still these lights that are burning in the darkness, and they're not just philosophical abstractions. They're real lives that are benefited and bettered through that.
Yeah, very well put.
Well, do help us with some of the definitions, because you use some terms that I'd love just to help our audience be familiar with.
Sure.
And I don't entirely know who the audience for the show is. Ethan and I make this show mainly hoping that high school debaters will listen. And
I'm sure you're making your own audience. So that's great.
Probably. We also I try pretty hard just to get anyone and everyone to listen to the show.
Right.
And but there's at least some element of this show that in my mind is a bit of subversive conservatism. I'm hoping that we attract people who would never call themselves conservative or use the language. So help us with let's do a couple definitions. First with humanism, because you go to pretty strong lengths to defend the term and to really try and rescue that term from the way secular humanists use it. So how would you explain this concept of humanism that really is a huge piece of this work?
You know, the easiest way, Josh, is just to think of humanists as someone who's a humanist is someone who studies the humanities. Really, that's the most simple definition. And I think it's about the most accurate definition. So for me, a proper kind of humanism goes back to Heraclitus. It goes back to Socrates. It goes back to ancient Greece and that discovery, or at least that attempt to try and define who and what we are. In the 20th century, that term became so ubiquitous during the first part of the 20th century that all kinds of forces started vying for it. So you get Marxist humanists and secular humanists. And part of, I think, a reaction, and in some ways, I'm sure there's a bit of a mischievous side in me, but I know that when I mention humanism to usually a Christian audience, there's always a kind of gasp or a reaction, like, well, that's just terrible, right? Humanism is anti-God. And humanism's not, traditionally, it's not anti-God. It actually is extremely pro-God, but it also tries to recognize that within the human person, there is both good and bad. So I think it would be hard, though Calvin was a humanist, but I think within certain forms of Christianity, humanism probably rubs Christians the wrong way, simply because it does seem to emphasize so much the human as opposed to God. But it shouldn't do that. I mean, really, even with Calvinism, I think, or at least Calvinism would be most prone, because of the total depravity of man, to be very leery. But Calvin's first book was a meditation on the poetry of Seneca. So, he was really looking at humanism and what the humanists were doing at the time, at least the Stoics. So, I mean, really for me, I think that humanism is a kind of way to explore the humanities and to understand the human person as higher than the animals, but lower than God and lower than the angels. So really trying to find our place almost in justice of what humanism is. But I do think at this point, humanism has become so corrupt by certain forces and certain ideologies that I think it is necessary to have the descriptive Christian humanism in front of it. 100 years ago, the Christian wouldn't have been necessary, but now it is, because that word has taken on such a life of its own.
Which is not to say that everyone that you then include in the biographical sketches is necessarily a Christian humanist.
No, that's right. But they're allies in some way.
Okay. I have to tell you, I was very surprised to see Margaret Atwood in here.
Oh,
That threw me for a loop. I was like, what on earth?
She would probably be surprised to see herself in there.
But you had a great section in there where you talked about just her appearance. Yeah. That was great.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's very good. And I've had a chance to read through a lot of her interviews, and she's a very interesting, complex person. Not at all what I think the media portrays her to be. Oh, and I like the fact she's a troublemaker. She's a troublemaker for the right things, I think.
I think so. I've avoided. I haven't read her most recent novel that's picking up after The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, I've avoided that too. I've got it, but I haven't read it.
I'm a little worried because I enjoyed The Handmaid's Tale the first time I read it.
I did too.
I watched the first season of the Hulu series.
I didn't watch.
Oh, it's so dark. I mean, it's just so. There is no hope there, and I didn't see where it could go. So I'm afraid that her novel may have been shaped by the direction of the TV show, but
it would not shock me. Wow. Yeah.
Well, let's back up to another definition word. It says, this word conservative. It shows up in a lot of places. It's a major part of your scholarship, I know, and it's all over this book. And yet, not every one of you have one guy in here who Friedrich Hayek blatantly denies being a conservative.
Sure.
And if I followed your thought correctly, you kind of want to call him a conservative, even though he doesn't like the term. And you kind of explained more of because he was coming from an Eastern European or Central European context, he kind of had a different meaning for that. So help our audience know, what does it mean to be a conservative, and why is this word significant?
Yeah, I think the easiest way, Josh, and it's kind of like with Christian humanism, there were a lot of people in the 20th century who self-identified as Christian humanists, but they were very different one from another, especially in their politics. And I think conservatism is a similar kind of word because there are a lot of people over the last 100 years who are self-identified as conservatives, but we wouldn't necessarily see them in the same light, and we wouldn't even see them necessarily as fitting together that well, but they certainly, at least they claim that term. I mean here in the same way that I meant humanism at the most basic level, I mean conservatism is the most basic level too. And that is that to conserve the best of what we've inherited and to try and pass that on. So, for me, it's Edmund Burke and the idea of the eternal contract, that we are all in this. Those who've been born, those who are alive today, and those who are still yet to be born. I mean, I think all of those people in some way fit into this. So it's kind of a large span. When I say conservative, it's not just of the past, but it's conserving certain things from the past, but also conserving human dignity and trying to figure out what that is. So I don't really mean it as a political term, though I know it's almost impossible to separate it from politics, especially given where the current, everything is at the moment, and the labeling and the kind of chaos and the anger and the hatred that's out there right now. Certainly, I think conservatism has been a word that's been hijacked by first the radio personalities and now the politicos in all kinds of ways.
Sure, but I do love that idea, Burke's idea of the eternal contract of the if I can remember the phrasing right, it's the living, the dead, and the unborn are all
and the yet
bound,
to be born.
The yet to be born. They're all bound together, where the living receive what is passed to them, and they conserve it so that they can pass it on to the yet to be born. It's a beautiful idea. I love how that really orients a certain attitude towards the past. That's not completely. Right. I think C.S. Lewis talks about how it's not necessarily uncritical. It's not that we're taking everything, but instead it's rather, okay, how do we curate this and recognize what's of value and make sure that those yet to be born have access to what's of value? It's such a beautiful concept.
I love what you just said, Josh. The idea of curating, I think, is a perfect, right? That's what we do through prudence. We judge. Mm-hmm. Is this good? Is it not good? Is it partially good and it needs to be reformed? Yeah, I mean, I think those are the things that we have to do. But yeah, curating is a great way. If you don't mind, I'll probably use that at some point.
Sure,
that's
please
a great
do.
way of thinking about it.
Well,
really great way. Well, and I love, too, you remember C.S. Lewis said, if we don't do that, we're guilty of chronological snobbery. Right, we give our own generation some kind of benefit that it really doesn't deserve, simply because we're living in the moment. We tend to privilege it, but there has to be more to it than just what we have at the moment.
Which was another piece that all of these people that you wrote about have in common, that they would all be in agreement with Lewis that there's a lot of value in reading old books, and that part of that conservation comes through the reading of old books.
Yeah, I would agree. Josh, I lost you there for a second. Sorry, but I totally agree.
Yep.
I think that value of being able to talk to people in the past and then present that to people in the future is just critical to this understanding of a good society.
Now, as I read through Beyond Tenebrae, there were a lot of names that I recognized. Irving Babbitt, Willa Cather, Tolkien, Christopher Dawson. Sure. I was not surprised that Russell Kirk managed to get 2 chapters. That seemed fitting. And, of course, Hayek, Brad Birzer. But there were a bunch of people I'd never heard of before. I don't know T.E. Holm. I don't know Cannon B.I. Bell, Theodore Haker, Wolfe, Kilby. I really want to read the book you cited by Clyde Kilby about his summer with Tolkien. That sounded like so much fun.
Yeah.
Are there other people that you thought about adding and decided not to? Or I know you said you kind of curated your own list from essays you've previously written. Are there other names that you would add in maybe a later volume expanding on the idea? Or
I would love to do a little bit more, for example, on C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield. So some of the different inklings, I think that there could have been separate essays. There are a couple of conservatives too. Robert Nisbet, I'd love to have more on, but I'm doing some things on Nisbet in other projects.
Okay.
So there are a couple of those figures, but I love coming across. So I never would have known, for example, Theodore Hacker at all until I had come across him in Dawson. And Dawson had really praised him. And I thought, well, I should check this guy out. And then when I read his little book he wrote in 1934 on Virgil as kind of the defining figure of Western civilization, it was mind-boggling. And then I found out he was this anti-Nazi and he was in the underground. It's just like, how great could this guy be? He loves Virgil and he hates the Nazis. It's like,
what more can you ask for?
And then, he tragically died. The U.S. accidentally bombed him, during the raid on Munich in 1945. So he almost survived the war, but an Allied bomb hit his house. It's just crazy. So, these guys, they all have stories to them. T.E. Holm was one of those guys that I came across probably a decade ago. And the more I read him, the more I kind of fell in love with the guy. He was a mentor to T.S. Eliot, and he was really the founder of Imagist Poetry. And he has this salon in England right before World War I. And then as soon as the war starts, he volunteers and he dies in the trenches. It's just like, you can't make these characters up, right? They're just amazing. Wow. So, and Dawson had said, and Eliot too, they both said that T.E. Holm was the greatest man of their generation, and he would have changed the world had he lived. And how can you not go right with that, right? There's got to be something there.
Oh, man. High praise.
Those are the kind I love finding people like that. Sister Madaleva Wolfe, I had also not been that familiar with until I realized that she was the president of St. Mary's and she'd studied with Tolkien and Lewis. So then I got her memoir and, it's kind of following one trail after another and discovering these people and really falling in love with them and then finding out who they love and moving on.
You had I just found the line I wanted to read. You had this great line on page 127 about Sister Madaleva Wolfe. Given her own background as a poetess, a farmer, a nun, and a university president, she often answered the question as to what her favorite books were with these three: the Bible, the Oxford English Dictionary, and various seed catalogs.
Isn't that great?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I thought that was wonderful.
I'm glad you caught that, Josh. Thanks. Those, again, I love finding stuff like that. Those are just such great quotes.
Oh, the you had the in Kilby's chapter, the stuff about Tolkien being so disorganized killed me. Yeah. I had to stop and read. I read the paragraph to Jen about when Kilby wanted to rationalize the library, and Tolkien was like, "But then I'd never find anything again." I was like, "Oh."
You can imagine it was just stacks and stacks of books and papers. Yeah, I'm sure it looked like a hobbit hole.
Must have.
Definitely.
Oh, let's talk about Eric Voegelin for just a moment.
Sure.
I have wanted to read Voegelin for years, and I have tried to read Voegelin on a couple of different occasions. I remember there was I don't know if you remember Dakota Fuller.
Oh, sure.
Dakota took a class. We were roommates one year at Hillsdale, and he took a class where he read The New Science of Politics, and I was like, oh, maybe I should try it. I could not make heads or tails of Voegelin, but I read your chapter about Voegelin, and I understood what you had to say about Eric Voegelin. So could you just speak to Voegelin for a moment? Who was he? What was the importance of his ideas? If you want to tackle metaxy and where that falls in, that would be amazing. But help our audience know a little bit about Eric Voegelin. What should we know?
Yeah, so he was born in 1901 and died in 1985. And he actually lectured at Hillsdale a couple of times. He taught at Notre Dame and at the University of Dallas. But he was a pretty curmudgeonly, kind of weird figure. I think he was brilliant, but he was truly odd. He was a friend of Hayek's when they were young men, and they were both in the Mises circle together in Austria. But Vogelin and Hayek, of course, there was like a bit of a divide in that Mises circle between those who were Christian and those who were Jewish. But Vogelin was a Lutheran. Interestingly enough, even though he's from Austria, you'd think he would be a Catholic, but was actually a Lutheran and was pretty devout about it. But he had come across a book by Hans Urs von Balthasar, one of the great kind of unsung theologians of the 20th century. And there was actually a footnote in one of von Balthasar's works about the meaning of Prometheus and the idea of symbols. And Vogelin just became absolutely entranced with this idea of permanent symbols in society that always exist, but they become corrupt over time. And so you and I, in Vogelin's way of thinking, you and I could see something like a Liberty Bell, and it immediately resonates with us because that symbol is so important to who and what we are. But it also means that someone like a demagogue could take that symbol and make it something other than what it really is. And that was the kind of thing that Vogelin was always worried about, that we would take these myths and symbols and do evil with them because they had such power for us. So a lot of what he argued was try a return to the basic element of what a symbol was. And he actually argued that the American Revolution was in and of itself one of the great moments of what he called anamnesis, where we would remember what is properly true. And he was even though he was not an American, he was a huge fan of the revolution and really thought that it attempted to right the world. But he essentially argues that things like communism and fascism, the reason they meant so much is because they used Christian symbolism, but they warped it. And so by using those kind of true things but warping them, this is really more or less the definition of evil for Vogelin, that would happen. So metaxy is a little bit, to get into that, Josh, it's a little bit complicated, but metaxy essentially meant, it's a fancy way of saying you and I are both flesh and spirit. Okay. And so the metaxy is simply, it's a way of a Christian trying to balance how we are both spiritual beings and physical beings at the same time. Metaxy, and I'm not even sure that's the proper way of pronouncing it in the Greek, but this in between. And so Vogelin thought a lot of our errors in society came when we were either too spiritual or too material, and that because of the incarnation, we had to work diligently to balance the material and the spiritual. So that was his big. That's Vogelin in 2 minutes. That's
excellent. I know we may have lost some people there, but that's okay.
No, sorry.
That's all right. That made sense, and I know he is someone who is of great intellectual caliber and respect. I mean, I've followed the journal Anamnesis for a few years, I've seen the I think it's the Ciceronian Society out of Louisiana State. I know there's a couple different Vogelin websites that are dedicated to preserving his work and applying his ideas. He's a weighty figure, so I appreciate you helping us kind of wade through some of that.
My pleasure. I mean, he's worth knowing, and there are things, Josh. I mean, I would recommend his Chicago lectures, The New Science of Politics. It is probably a pretty good place to start. But he also gave a series of lectures at the University of Munich, I think, in 1958, called something like Science, Gnosticism, and Politics. And that's probably the best introduction. He met, at the time, Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict. Oh. Ratzinger attended those lectures and was very influenced by that, too. So all these weird Christian humanist connections.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Well, I wonder if we could just kind of go through a couple of passages from the book. Just get your thoughts on these. There were several places where I thought there was either you had great questions or really good lines. And I thought a couple of those from the introduction. This is the top of introduction, page 20. You ask, what happens then when a small republic asks the world to remember what is good and true and beautiful? How can one serve as leaven to the rest, persuading the others to remember? Is this the Ciceronian republicanism coming out in this book? I mean, and with the liberal arts view of the good, the true, and the beautiful, kind of still there.
Rather blatantly.
Yeah.
So that was that idea of no matter what, we can have this republic of letters, the liberal arts, that we can really continue this great conversation, and even if we're kind of forgotten. I mean, I'm always when I think, Josh, of, and it's always humbling, just finishing a course on Western civilization, Western heritage, just finishing it today at Hillsdale. When you think about some of the people that we teach, people like Socrates and Cicero, they all really, not only did they give their lives, but they came at the end of something. And I think in many ways, Socrates is so powerful, not just because he's a martyr to what he believes, but because there's a nostalgia in what he's doing too. He's trying, Athens is already done when he's executed. And he's remembering the Athens of his youth. He's remembering what it could have been and what it should have been. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what the liberal arts is meant to do. Even in a society that thinks the liberal arts are worthless and they mock them, our job is still the same. It's to keep reminding people and to play that role, even when it's not a popular role. I think that's, the greatest liberal arts thinkers in history have always gone against the grain. And many of them, again, Socrates, Cicero, Thomas More, they paid with their lives. And I mean, there's something very noble in that, but I think it's also, it's inspiring, but it's disheartening, and it's all those things at once.
Well, that note of struggle seemed to be kind of where you ended the introduction with the line, "In a time of troubles, they weathered the storm. They preserved the best of what had come before them. They carried the one light away from the abyss and through the darkness." That line reminded me of the part of Chesterton's Ballad of the White Horse, where Alfred has the vision. He encounters Mary, and he comes away from that with this message that the sky is growing darker and the sea is rising higher. I come seeking Christian men who want to die.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no come on, guys, we're going to win. It's like, all right, who's ready to sign up for a worthy cause in which we're all going to die?
Yes, that's right, Josh. And I love that part of Chesterton, too. I'm totally with you. It's such a great, that line, my own line, for what it's worth, I took that, it's from Ulysses. It's from Tennyson's. And when Ulysses asks, who are we? I mean, we once struggled with gods, right? Clearly we can do something good still. So that's where I was getting that. That was a play on that.
Oh, so good.
But maybe, hopefully, a more Christianized paganism there.
Oh, of course. On page 29, you gave us some great stuff about what it means to be a biographer. Which line was that? The biographer makes the fact the story, and along the way, the story becomes the fact. What then is the key to a good biography? I believe the only true good biographer, or autobiographer, as I believe they employ the same gifts and talents, is the one who is endowed with the ability and the will to entertain serious imagination. What do you mean by serious imagination, and how has that worked out in your own work as a biographer?
Yeah, so I mean it this way, Josh. By imagination here, I mean specifically that if I were to study you, I could put myself in your place. And I don't just mean in the kind of like trite way of saying, would I walk in your shoes? I mean, can I actually see the world through your eyes? Can I understand what kind of struggles you have and what kind of successes you have and the way that you view things? To me, that's what a good biographer does. And it means that, no matter what, at least from my perspective, even if I were to write your story, Josh, it would still be Brad writing Josh's story. So you're still a good biographer. There are always two personalities involved. There's the personality who's being written upon, and the person who's doing high data, but has to be neutral, is completely messing up. I think part of the art is it is a person speaking to a person. And then you've got the reader, who's a third person, who's the audience. And it's really meant to be the third person, the audience, should be reading the conversation between the subject and the biographer, in my mind. I think otherwise, if we're just trying to repeat what was already there, I think it loses its soul. It becomes really just too materialistic and doesn't allow for a real spirituality to kind of to reign in all of that.
So is that the process that you're trying to evoke when you sit down? I know your most recent biography, if I'm getting this right, is the biography of Andrew Jackson.
Right.
I mean, were you trying to kind of be in Andrew Jackson's soul as best as you could and express that?
I don't know if I succeeded, but he was so honest, actually. It was kind of hard not to, I felt like I got to know him right away just because he's brutal and violent and disgusting at times, but he was so honest. And there are people I've written on, for example, my dissertation. There were people in my dissertation I still don't understand, and I don't think I understood then. I don't think I'll ever totally understand. People that I think I got away with, like I wrote a biography of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, one of the founders, and I don't think I ever completely got him, but I think I got enough of him to at least tell his story. But there was something in him that I just had a really hard time relating to. But people like Russell Kirk, I felt like I knew him right away. Tolkien, I felt like I've known since I was a little kid. So, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And maybe I'm fooling myself as well, but there's definitely a feeling there. It's like, no, when I started writing Jackson, it's like, I get this guy. And partly just because there's no dishonesty. It's like whatever he says is what he believes. The guy had no filter at all.
Oh. There's something amazing about.
Fun. Even when he did things I didn't like, it was fun to read him just because I could get it and understand it.
There is something amazing about that attempt to get into a different mindset, a different time and place, and trying to see the world through different eyes. That's amazing.
And Josh, I'm sure you're the same way. I could never write a biography of someone I hated. I could never spend that kind of time with Hitler or Stalin. And I admire people who can do it, but that would be way too much evil and flirting with too much evil to do something like that. I think I'm only really good. Personally, I'm only good when I'm writing about people I like.
It reminds me of the Dr. Gamble took us through.
I was going to mention Gamble.
Yeah, we can't do this episode without bringing him in somehow. I mean, I remember his philosophy of history class. He took us through so carefully and so well, built that class till we've gone through all these different models of ways people consider history, and then we land on Butterfield. And for Butterfield, the whole goal of history is compassion. And it's the point where you understand the historical person to the extent that the critical judgment sort of melts away in your understanding, and all that's left is love for the person who is in these moments, no matter what choices the person makes. And I still don't know what to do with some of the obviously. I mean, what do you do with Stalin and Hitler and Mao? They don't really fit in a Butterfieldian sense of studying history.
Right. There's a definite romance in that.
Right. But for the vast majority, I've just that's been something I've come back to year in and year out to think of.
Yeah.
And it's the same idea I find now. I've ended up teaching more literature than I have history over the years, and the same thing happens with getting into a novel and understanding a character.
Yes. No, absolutely, Josh. And isn't that great? I mean, that to me, I think that's a real moment of historical consciousness to recognize that. And Gamble, I was going to bring up because first of all, he's a gentleman scholar, right? But he's one of those rare individuals who I think can be extremely critical and maintain all of his morality. I mean, I can't see Richard compromising on somebody simply because, I could find myself writing a biography of Woodrow Wilson and starting to like him because, I just start sympathizing with him. I'm not saying that's why I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Richard wouldn't do that. Richard would maintain his critical stance, and I admire him for that, but I wouldn't be good at that.
I don't know. A few times I've tried to get close to Wilson. I can't get past the progressivism.
Somebody, I better like him.
Yep. On page 79. Let me ask you one more question from the text, and we'll shift.
Yeah, sure. Oh, this is great, Josh.
You ask a really good, I thought, just critical diagnosis question of our particular moment in time on page 79. Have we traded our own individual taste for those of the PR men, the ad men, the marketers, the sellers of ready-made standardization, the promoters of the new and improved rather than the good and the true. Have the corporations become our new gods? That was a great. I mean, those were penetrating questions. What prompted you to include those questions?
Yeah, so part of that comes from C.S. Lewis, and especially from The Abolition of Man, where he talks a lot about what happens with our secondary nature when we become so used to the ads and the constant bombardment of propaganda. But it also, it's from reading Orwell and trying to think about what is propaganda versus what is art. So some of those things, Josh, a couple of those things I vented, and I'm glad that they came off maybe more intellectual than I meant them to be. That's good. But some of those were just kind of me, rather than saying blatantly, "You stupid idiot corporation, stop this." It was like, let's think about this philosophically. So I was probably just being a little, maybe a little bit polite about things I was angry about, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And am I correct in remembering that you have a libertarian streak as well?
Very strong.
Okay.
But it's also, for me, Josh, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but one of the greatest things that comes out of 20th century conservatism was its hatred of conformity. Mm-hmm. And that, for me, when I was a kid, and especially when I was in high school and then in college, it was so important for me to belong to something that didn't conform, if that makes sense. I know there's just belonging, but and that, debate was unusual. How many kids did debate? And, we used to walk around with I'm a member of the NFL, of course, ask me about the real NFL. And I still got, actually, those buttons are probably right back there. I've got some of those old, I had some great things about, if you want to date somebody, ask a debater. Really, this is stuff that you couldn't get away with, but in the 80s it was funny. That, and I loved that. I loved being a part of the squad, but then we were a squad of individuals, and that, for me, in the Reagan era, conservatism was about being your own person. It wasn't about conforming to the government or to a corporation, or some bureaucracy. It was about being yourself. And I suppose you might call that libertarian, but for me, growing up, that was just conservative. So that kind of individualist strain.
Oh, I think there's definitely a lot. I think there's a lot of value in that. I've been more sensitive. Social media has gotten better and better at correctly targeting me with their ads. I've actually found myself clicking on a couple of Facebook things, knowing that, like, every time I click on this, I know I'm informing their algorithm of how better to target me. But it still looks interesting. Right. Yeah. Over on page 115, you make a very interesting statement about O.M. Barfield and the role he places of poetry in society. Barfield, therefore, holds the poets as one of the most important offices in Western civilization. Without the development of poetry and the recognition of the necessity of the poet, the Western world will become lost in scientific or scientistic nominalism and pragmatism, and the organic unity of the West will be lost, perhaps permanently. Would you agree with Barfield here? Is this? Do you think he's right about the role of the poet?
That's Barfield from his senior thesis at Oxford.
As an undergraduate senior.
His senior thesis. He was 21 when he wrote that. Oh my
goodness!
It's a book called Poetic Diction. It's one of my favorite books. I read it. I've reread it many, many times, and he published it a few years after he graduated. But it was his senior thesis, and I think it's so much a part of the Inklings, that idea of we can teach people through Narnia or through Middle Earth, or, and then growing up with that, it's been everything. Now I'm at age 52. This has just been a part of my life as far back as I can remember, Josh, this understanding of poetry and the poetic imagination. So I also think that's also a really important thing to kind of find that conformity, to have that poetic insight to things. And, think about what you guys do. With debate is you find out A, B, C, D, and E, but you've got to figure out what connects them. And it's that poetic imagination that allows you to connect them. And that, to me, that was one of the greatest things I got out of debate was it's not just the facts. Anybody can learn the facts. It's how do you connect those and make a case out of them. And, that's hard work for the affirmative and the negative. It's very hard work. And I loved it. I mean, I cherish those. I can still see myself back in the summer of '83 making an affirmative case where I had all my 4x6 cards around me and I sat cross-legged and I made my case. I have great memories of those days. And I think I still do the same thing. It's just usually more up here than it is with my 4x6 cards. So
it was my senior year at Hillsdale. I did a programmed oral interpretation piece where I was working with a lot of poetry. And the theme that tied it all together was the Greek word mythos for story. And I was looking at the way that story creates the world that we experience. I've had a bad. It's been literarily quite fun, and theologically it's very unhealthy. But I've had this flirtation with postmodernism for years.
Oh.
That was one
Nietzsche's
of those.
Fault.
Maybe. It's more Neil Gaiman than Nietzsche for me.
Oh,
but
sure.
They're similar in some respects.
Yeah.
Gaiman's just much more positive and British.
That's right.
As part of that, I remember working with a poem by B.H. Fairchild that was called Body and Soul. And by the end of the poem, you discover the punchline is that the whole poem is about Mickey Mantle coming up to the plate, and no one recognizes that it's Mickey Mantle. They think it's just this little shrimp of a guy.
I don't know that. That's great.
And he just knocks the ball so far out, and it's like these old grizzled miners who are playing on a Sunday afternoon, and here's this punk kid who says, "Hey, I want to join." And it's Mickey Mantle. But
that's fantastic.
The line that I'm thinking of goes, those are the facts, and the facts are true, but the facts are not the truth.
Yeah.
And that one stuck with me because I think there's a
good one.
There's a distinction there between we can know all the facts, but we have to be able to put the facts into an interpretive position such that we can actually determine the truth of them. And that truth is greater than the parts of the facts somehow.
I like it a lot. That was Fairchild?
That was Fairchild, B.H. Fairchild.
Okay.
I'll try and find a copy. If I can find a copy of the poem, I'll send you a link to it.
That's great. Thanks, Josh. Yeah.
Well, you by the time I got to the end of the book, I will confess the conclusion left me. The conclusion was a little gloomy. Where do you see Christian humanism going from here? Are there current Christian humanists who are writing and keeping up the faith? And where do you see the future of all of this?
Yeah, there are good people like James Matthew Wilson, who's a poet. It's fantastic. And we have musicians like one of my closest friends, Kevin McCormick, who's a great poet and classical guitarist, and people like Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame. I mean, I think there are a lot of people out there who really are doing good things. But there's a zeitgeist. We're in a moment right now of this intense anger in society. And I would guess it's probably a lot like what it was like in 1968 and 69. And we'll get over it. I mean, there'll be damage, but we'll get over it. And 10 years from now, I would guess we'll be in a better position. You think about something like what happened with Reagan coming in the 1980s. No one would have expected that in 1968. No one would have predicted that. Not even in probably 1978 would they have predicted that. And I think that God surprises us and he blesses us with certain people and certain reminders from time to time. And we're probably due one. Not that I know the mind of God or have the right to demand anything, but certainly I think, just looking at the way things have gone historically, we're at a low point, but we'll come out of it. But we do. It's going to take, I think, for those of us who believe in this stuff and actually, the romantics among us, you, me, others, I mean, our work's really cut out for us for the next few years, and we're going to be lonely. We're going to be really lonely. It may get lonelier before it gets better.
Which is I think that's a realistic depiction. I'm quite happy to be at a less than traditional residential PhD program with Faulkner. But one of the things that led me to that program was
Josh.
Well, it was just a general. I mean, it's pretty gloomy to look at the academy and look at where the academy is today and kind of where that's going.
Get your degree because you want your degree. That's the important thing.
That's it.
Yeah.
With all of that, as I'm very excited about Beyond Tenebrae. I'm excited to kind of see how if there's where folks go with that. Now, I do want to give you a chance to on the show, if I could ask you to just. I know longtime listeners will not be surprised by this because I've tried to plug Hillsdale quite frequently on the show because I'm convinced I need at least one of my students to wind up at Hillsdale. And
nice.
They keep applying everywhere else, so I'm just going to keep telling them they need to at least apply to Hillsdale. But
absolutely.
But Brad, you've been at Hillsdale for how long now? How many years?
This is my 21st year.
So I'm sure along the way there have been opportunities to go teach at other places. I know you've had at least one sabbatical year when I've been paying attention. I'm sure you've probably had at least 2 or 3 at this point. I would imagine.
Yeah.
What's kept you at Hillsdale? I mean, what is it about this small liberal arts college in the middle of nowhere in southern Michigan? I mean, the town is not the reason to be at Hillsdale. I would assume.
The hardest thing for me, Josh, has been growing up in Kansas and Deidre being from Texas. We grew up in places that really, really cared about living in that place. So I miss Kansas, and Deidre misses Texas a lot, and that's been hard. But other than that, I have colleagues like Mark Kaltoff and Paul Marino and Richard Gamble, Steve Smith. I mean, I have an amazing group of colleagues who support me and I support them, and we care about each other and we care about common things. We care about the good, the true, and the beautiful. And, most importantly for me, Josh, it's been people like you. I just had, 20 years of incredible students who care about ideas, who take the world seriously, and who want to change it, not in the kind of wave a magic wand, but who actually want to do the hard work and make change. And that has meant everything to me. A place where I can actually speak my mind and be myself and yet believe in the mission of the college. It's been fantastic. Just great. And I can't imagine being at another place. I really enjoyed my year at Colorado, and I like my students there and I like my colleagues, but it wasn't Hillsdale. The scenery was really nice. It was like really, really, really nice. But I missed my students and I missed my colleagues a lot.
That's great to hear. What advice would you offer to 2 different audiences? Because I remember you were saying before we started recording that your son Nathaniel is now a junior at the college.
Right, yeah.
So you've now seen the college from the perspective of a parent who is going through the college application process, because I assume Nathaniel at least did apply to a few other places as well.
Right.
So what advice would you offer first to students thinking about college and what they should be looking for in a college? But then would you offer any advice to parents as they're kind of helping their children navigate that whole process?
Yeah, definitely visit every place that you're thinking about. I would never, ever just go to a place after being accepted without having checked it out. I mean, checking out the student body, checking out the physical campus, figuring out what classrooms are like. I think, even if someone comes for a day or 2, I think they can get a real feel for the college. I mean, we're not exactly subtle, right?
No.
I think you can learn a lot, and you can see what type of student is here very quickly. But I would also be really, I would be leery. And you're right. I mean, we did have to go through this process. And with Gretchen, too, who's now a freshman at the college. And we've got Maria Grace coming up. She's still 2 years away. But it's interesting. I think one of the things we were shocked by was how gimmicky places have gotten. Even good places, the way that they sell themselves is so cheap. And, it's all about what they can do for you, not what you can do for them. It's not about what this place means. It's what kind of job you can get. And those things are not unimportant. I mean, they're important, but there are ways to do it. One of the best ways you'll get a good job is loving what you do. And if you're just going through a training program just to get there, you're never going to love it. It will always be something you're trained for. And that, I think, it's one of the things that the liberal arts has always understood that people who are not liberal arts have never understood. And that is that you've got to love what you do. And you've got to, if you're not doing what you love, it just is not, you're not going to be great at it ever. You're not going to be great at it. And you may be really proficient, but you'll never be great. And I just think that's something that people really take seriously. So I don't know if that helps, Josh, but
no,
that would be my
great
advice. So visit and take seriously what the college is saying to you. Definitely.
I think those are great pieces of advice, and I know I ended up at Hillsdale primarily because we did exactly that. My dad and I came up and visited. We actually did the same thing for Grove City College, but neither my dad nor I were at the time. I think we've both gotten better at this since then, but we were not great at long-term planning. We just kind of flew up and dropped in in Grove City, Pennsylvania, and they didn't really know what to do with us. They didn't really arrange a tour. It was cold and it was not terribly hospitable. But we arrived at Hillsdale. We did the same thing. We didn't really plan ahead, and they took great care of us. Turns out
they were ready for you.
They were not surprised. Like, oh, hey, well, you're here. Well, since you've come all the way from Virginia to Michigan,
right?
And I distinctly remember being in the old snack bar and looking out the window and watching Raymond Spiota. I didn't know him at the time, but watching Raymond Spiota walk across the quad, it had been the quad, in a baggy green elbow patch sweater with a long stem pipe and this scraggly goatee of a beard. And that was just the moment. I was like, I want to be here. I also sat on Dr. Kaltoff's Western Civ class, and there were serious things too, but it was...
Yeah, no, that's great. Raymond's serious.
But it was the atmosphere, and it was just knowing like there's just something here. I think that's key, agree. And the mission is great.
Well, I've had at least 3 Spiotas in class. So
wait, you have what?
I've had 3 Spiotas in class.
Wait, there's a third?
Yeah, Julia.
Oh, that's right. Julia she was older. Yeah. I didn't know Julia. I knew Raymond and Daniel.
She's great.
Oh, fantastic.
They're all great.
Well, Brad, where can our audience go to follow your work? I know you maintain several different websites, but where would you send people to check out your stuff?
I mean, we do some things for Spirit of Cecilia, right, which is kind of my Christian humanist website. But then I do most of my writing. I write 2 columns a week for the Imaginative Conservative. So that's always kind of the place to go. And then I do a lot with Tom Woods and Liberty Classroom, too. So, yeah, those are my three loves, Hillsdale, the Imaginative Conservative, and Tom Woods. So that's where I do most of my stuff. And I've been very blessed to have those outlets.
Oh, fantastic! Any last thoughts on Beyond Tenebrae or anything?
No, thanks for taking the book so seriously, Josh. That was great. You pulled out stuff I'd even forgotten about, so that's really good.
One of the last couple of years, I've been wrestling through a hermeneutical discussion of trying to figure out whether the author really is the one who determines the meaning of the book and. I'm not over there in the author is dead camp, but Gadamer did convince me that a book is the author's until the book is published, and at that point, a book sort of takes on a life of its own, and it's sort of this weird metaphysical dialogue between a non-present author through a written word that is interpreted through a reader who reads it based on his own moment and place and time that is completely different than what the author intended. So I don't know if what I pulled out was particularly true, but it certainly seemed interesting, and I'm glad you enjoyed.
Oh, definitely. It was great talking. It's always good talking to you, Josh. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, so glad. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest this evening has been Dr. Brad Birzer, holder of the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies and professor of history at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. He is the author of many books, including biographies of J.R.R. Tolkien, Christopher Dawson, and Russell Kirk, and most recently, the subject of most of our conversation tonight, Beyond Tenebrae, Christian Humanism in the Twilight of the West. The link is in the show description. Make sure to order your copy when you're done listening to the show. If you want to reach out to us to let us know what you think of this episode, you can do that in a variety of ways. You can email us at whatstherez@gmail.com. You could reach out to us over Facebook at facebook.com/whatstherez. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit with the handle at whatstherez_. And just in case you have been inspired by Dr. Birzer's love of debate to include more debate in your life, be sure to check out our premium debates. For $3 a month or $30 a year, you can access one recorded debate a month We call these Real Debates by Real People, where we have educated non-experts debating relevant, controversial issues. We've have episodes on gentrification, gun rights. In December, we're putting out a lighter episode since it's the holiday season, where Dr. Will Begley and I will square off on the resolution. People with PhDs should be called by the title doctor. You can find all of those episodes at whatstherez.podbean.com/premium. Thank you for joining us tonight for this episode of What's the Res? And until next time, work hard, speak well, and seek the truth.